I'm Leon Wieseltier. I sit upstairs at Brookings very happily. I'm joined by my friends. Immediately to my left is MK Ksenia Svetlova, who is a member of Knesset from Hatznua, the Zionist Union. Next to her is Rabbi Dov Lipman, who sat in Knesset, does no longer, for the Yesh Atid party. Next to him is Ilana Stein-Hain, who works at the Shalom Hartman Institute, where she's Director of Leadership Education. And next to her is Noah Efron, who teaches science, technology, and society at Bar Ilan in Israel. I'm going to preface this session with a few general remarks. I am not a political scientist. I have an allergy to data. And so I'm not going to be giving you numbers or pies or anything like that. What I'd like to do is to say a few general things about how to think about the question of religion and the state, drawing mostly upon the Israeli experience, but as some of you will detect, there will be echoes of the American tradition and the American experience as well. It's very important to begin, I think, by insisting that in order to understand the relationship between the religion and the state, one does not need to understand only the state. One needs also to understand religion. And understanding religion is not as easy as a lot of people seem to think it is. Political philosophers, political scientists can sometimes be very arrogant. They sometimes behave as if all the realms of life are there to pass before them, to be assigned their proper place in reality and how they should relate to each other, when in fact all these realms, including the religious realm, already exist. There already is a world of believers, Jewish believers, Muslim believers, Christian believers, and so on. And it's very important to state at the outset that when one tries to understand religion, one must not try to reduce religion to material or political or social or economic factors. They are enormously influential, and we'll get to all sorts of causes in our discussion, but it's very important to remember that the autonomy and the integrity of religion as a realm of human life, which requires its own understanding. I will give you an example. One of the things we talk about often, we talked about it yesterday, liberals talk about it and fantasize about it, is how religions change, right? Many people regard the solution to the conflicts that we're describing between an open society and a religious frame of mind, or between various beliefs in a democracy and so on, regard it as a question of religious reform. But it's very important to understand that religions do not change simply in convenient response to political realities. That is not how they evolve. They evolve on their own terms, and they cannot change except in a way that will preserve their integrity. It's very important to understand that. So, for example, if you look at, in the Jewish case, halacha, or you look in the Muslim case, sharia, which we've heard a lot about lately, it's very important to understand that religious law changes, but it changes in a way that leaves it consistent with its own principles. It cannot simply decide there's a new political reality, there's a recession, there's a new president, there's a new czar, there's a new king, and so we're going to believe different things or behave differently. That is not how it happens. And there are internecine fights, quarrels, that are taking place within the various religions, the outcome of which the rest of us have no power to determine. And sometimes we find ourselves sort of waiting kind of helplessly in the margins, hoping that various theological or even civil wars will resolve themselves so that we can get on with the business of an open society or a democracy. But again, the first thing that must be said is that we're here to talk not only about what the state needs, what needs from religion, but how religion might regard the state. It is important also to declare that the question is not just the question of whether religion damages the state. There is also the question of whether the state damages religion. And there are many, many ways in which the intersection of religion and politics is as unsalutary for religion as it is for politics. Having said that, I want to say a few words about the question of the secularism of the state, right? What is the spiritual status of a state, right? What is the spiritual status of Israel? And for certain of our Christian brothers and sisters here, what is the spiritual status of the United States? right? This is not an idle question. For a minority of believers, the state, and now I'll refer to Israel, actually has spiritual status. And they have various theological ways to describe the founding of Israel as the beginning of the redemption, as Atchalta di Geula, and so on. Even the government's acquiescence in the power of the chief rabbinate, which I have to say I regard as the most illegitimate and poisonous institution in Jewish life. Even the state's acquiescence in the chief rabbinate is to some extent some claim for spiritual status for the state. And of course, there are Israelis, believing Israelis, for whom the problem is not the relationship between the religion of Judaism and the Jewish state, but between the Jewish state and the land of Israel. And we can talk about that. The land presents a kind of permanent metaphysical, theological temptation to Israeli politics, which it does not always succeed in withstanding. But for most Zionists, for most Israelis, and for Haredim, I might add, who are ideologically consistent with the messianic beliefs of the medieval and early modern times, the state is itself secular. And we in America, more so than in Israel, we have a very, very sophisticated body of thought about the neutrality that the state should have as a matter of principle in matters of religion. But I want to suggest to you that there are two ways to think about secularism. There are two concepts of secularism, two theories of the separation of religion from the state that I want to present to you that will apply to the various cases. The first I call hard secularism, the second I call soft secularism. Hard secularism is the view that religion must be banished from the public sphere because it is false, because it is an illusion, because it is dangerous, because this is the view that was espoused by Voltaire, and this eventually led during the French Revolution to the burning of the churches, and this is the view that was espoused most notoriously by Marx, right? And this eventually led to the Evsektia in the Russian Revolution and other such phenomenon. This is a coercive secularism. You see remnants of it in the French doctrine of laïcité. It is the idea that everybody must be secular. Now, the problem with the idea that religion must be banished from the public square because it is false is obviously it leads to enormous intolerance and even to cruelty. Even to outright cruelty. The history of this idea in politics has a sordid career. And secondly, it implies that if it's illegitimate to believe in these things in the public sphere, it's also illegitimate to believe in them in the private sphere. So this idea of hard secularism, which was really the Enlightenment's first big blow in this direction, is a very problematic one. I should also add that there is this view that religion should be banished from the public sphere, not because it's false, but because it's true. This was Jefferson's view and Locke's view and Moses Mendelssohn's view, that religion is true and truth has no need of power and only error has need of government, as Jefferson said. And so just get it away from here. It's beneath religion. Okay. But there is a kind of secularism which is compatible, which is necessary for pluralism, that wants to banish religion from the public sphere, not because it's true or false, but whether or not it's true or false. The question of its truth or falsity, and this is very hard for believers to accept. Not secular people have no problem with this, but this is very hard for believers to accept. The question of its truth or falsity is deemed to be irrelevant. And the advantage of this, obviously, is that it is a charter for social peace. It is a charter for social peace. The price one pays for it is to take the ultimate questions and demote them in the society. And as I said, in an open society, and again, secular people such as ourselves, we rarely recognize this. The people who are asked to restrain themselves and inhibit themselves in an open society are not the unbelievers, they're the believers, who after all believe they are in possession of an exclusive truth and are being told to keep it out of the street, which is a huge claim to make. The third point I want to make, and I'll stop in a moment, is one about freedom of religion. It's very important, since we're going to talk about freedom of religion, to understand that whereas a public square that is no longer ruled by religion is not free of religion, right? It's not at all free of religion. Nonetheless, freedom of religion is a secular right, a secular dispensation, and a secular privilege. and a secular privilege. The fact that religion flourishes in a secular framework does not make the framework itself any less secular. It's very important to understand that the secularism of the state, not only is it not necessarily a blow to religion, it is actually a boon to religion, a benefit to religion, because it underwrites the possibility of religious freedom. I know of no monotheistic tradition that preaches anything like what we mean by religious freedom. There is tolerance in all the religious traditions to a lesser and later degree, but if you had to bet the farm on tolerance, I would go outside of religion to modern secular traditions, which we do and then reinterpret religions in that light. All right, I will stop with those general principles. I have a few more for later, but I want us to chat about many things. And I think we'll go from, I guess, right to left, just to be refreshing after the last election. So I'm going to ask Ksenia if you would say, everybody will speak for about 6 or 7 minutes, the way I did, and then we'll have a conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Leon. Good afternoon. When I first heard the speech of President Rivlin of the 4 tribes, the first thing that I thought that it's a horrible oversimplification of things, because why limit yourself with 4 tribes? In fact, maybe we have 44 tribes. What about the Mizrahi and Ashkenazi? What about overprivileged and underprivileged? What about the Russian speakers, my own community? What about the Ethiopian Jews? What about everybody else that are not, being represented in his particular speech? And then I thought again, and I thought, well, there is something to it. After all, there are 4, and not only because of the education systems. There are 4 education systems in Israel, this is true, but there are also other borders of these communities, of these 4 tribes. These are the borders of marriages. These 4 tribes do not intermarry. I'm not talking only about the Palestinian Arab minority, which is a different issue a little bit, and we're talking about both Muslims and Christians, of course, but I'm talking about also the Jewish tribes itself. The ultra-Orthodox do not mix with seculars. The seculars do not marry with the National Zionist, mostly. There are some cases here and there, but mostly not. So we are still living, in a way, the Milliyet system of the Ottoman Empire, which is the faith communities. So, of course, the margins are larger, and you can go from one community to another. It will be difficult. You might lose your own family on the way, especially if you are leaving your ultra-Orthodox community to go to someplace else, to any of the other 2 Jewish, or if you're leaving the Arab community and you're embracing the Judaism, which also happens very rarely, but then you really risk your life, So these margins are wider, but they're still very, very tough. You cannot really go through them. And from this issue of the lack of intermarriages, which is also predominated by the issue of religious faith, I will go to the issue of the relation between state and religion. So because we do not have this flow, which usually happens in other immigrant societies, because there is no flow that allowed otherwise, between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi, between Russian speakers and Amharic speakers and everybody else, these communities will continue to exist. And the question is, how else we will be able to make out of it the unique Israeli identity? Because what we have today, and it's being very strengthened by the government, especially by the current government and the current Ministry of Education of Naftali Bennett, is the Jewish identity and Israeli culture. So we have Jewish identity and Israel culture. And what does it really mean? When I speak about Jewish identity, do I speak about secular Jewish identity? Do I speak about Zionist religious Jewish identity? What about the Jewish culture in all of this? Where is this component of the Jewish identity? I'm personally myself, I came from the former Soviet Union. I was born in Moscow. If anybody would ask me 26 years ago, before my Aliyah, I would tell that I'm a Jewish and I'm a Soviet citizen. When I came to Israel, I finally became a Russian. How did it happen? Trick, magic. But this is just an example. And what I'm missing in Israel surprisingly, because I'm coming from Moscow. It's a big city with a lot of, also it will elude, but not only, not only the intermarriages, yes, and so on, but also the city where the Jewish culture was not very dominant, was not very bright, was not very exposed, and unlike other places, like in Ukraine and other places. But still there was a component to our identity, was which cultural, it was not religious one. And when years after I made it to Israel and I became a journalist before my political career, covered Arab affairs for a long time, and I interviewed Saeb Erekat, the chief negotiator of the Palestinian Autonomy. And I posed to him a question that I usually pose to Palestinian politicians, because the versions different tremendously to this question, okay, of their answer. So the answer was, why wouldn't you recognize Israel as a Jewish state? I'm personally not an advocate of this demand. I do not think that we need a stamp of anybody, whether Palestinians or Jordanians or Lebanese or Saudis or Americans, to see ourselves as a Jewish state. We are the state of the Jewish people. It's kind of an axiom. So, but it was interesting for me why he would say no. So he said to me, because I believe that Judaism is a religion, and religion only. It's not a nationality. So this is the kind of question mark with which I came back from Ramallah to Jerusalem, and I posed it to some people that I know from the religious Zionism community. Said, do you agree with this? Do you agree that our Jewish, identity is only comprised of the religious component? And you know what? Some of them didn't find the answer. They couldn't really tell to me whether, Saeb Erekat was wrong or not, because we believe that there is a Jewish nation. Well, in my Soviet passport, in my mother's Soviet passport, we had the special graph, number 5, in which it was mentioned that, we are Jews, unlike Russians, Ukrainian, or Belarusians. So, okay, the state recognizes us as a special ethnic minority. But here in Israel, when we come to Israel, then suddenly I understand that it's much more complicated. This is the religion component. There is absolutely no cultural component. It doesn't exist. The Yiddishkeit, or the Mizrahi Jewish culture that was brought from the Sephardic lands, does not exist anymore, or it exists in very, very limited formula. And as to the ethnic issue, then, well, considering the every second comment that I get on my Facebook pages since I was elected is, you're Russian, you should go back to Russia, you do not believe in Israel, then I can tell you that the ethnic component is very problematic as well. Okay, so then what does it leave us with? And I know I have 2 minutes.
It's fine.
But this is important. This is the pressing issues. This is the status quo, whether it's being eroded or not. And I personally believe that it's being eroded. It's not staying on the place, just like the water in the river. It cannot stay where it is. It's constantly on the move. This is the same with our conflict with the Palestinians. The reality is changing. And the same is within, where it has to do with the relations between the religion and the state. Things are changing, but not fast enough. Or maybe they're changing to the opposing side of what, some of us would want to see. And the issues are pressing. Some of them is, of course, the issue of literally the question of marriage. I made it to the podium of the Knesset just about a month ago with a bridal veil to present my law bill about returning the expenses to the couples that cannot get married in Israel. There are about 400,000 Israeli citizens, Jews, that cannot physically get married in Israel. Some of them are Jews. Others are not recognized as Jews. The third group are not Jews, but when they want to get married, they cannot be registered as couple. They have to go abroad. If the state forces these people to go abroad, the state should pay. It's simple logic. Because after they get back from either Cyprus or New York or Prague, their marriage is being recognized by the state, which is kind of an absurd, yes? So because, to force young couples to waste more money than they have to on these, huge marriages that we usually have in Israel, it's an absurd. The other issue is, of course, the recognition of Giyurim, of conservative and reform communities. They are not large, but they do exist. I believe that Israel is a state of all Jews. This is, as was said once by Yitzhak Rabin, by late Prime Minister, that we are the state and we are the responsibility. We are the responsibility and we are the promise to every Jew in the world. But if we make every Jew in the world or every second Jew in the world feel uncomfortable in an own state, but not recognizing the Georim, not recognizing their marriages, not recognizing them as Jews that can marry other Jews and consequently join this army of Israelis that cannot get married in their own state. So what does it mean? Where do we go from there? The last thing that I'm going to mention is of course, the issue of, well, I have to put it very bluntly, it's the question of racism. I'm not, again, speaking Muhammad, I'm sorry, yes, but I'm, concentrating here on this, the inter-Jewish relation. And of course, a lot of racism in Israel is expressed at your community. But I can tell you that within our own community, I'm a member of the Aliyah and Absorption Committee, and every single day I'm receiving complaints from Ethiopian Jews that cannot get married in the rabbinate, despite them both recognized as Jews in Israel. I receive complaints from Jews from my own community, from Russian speakers, that are being buried in separate plots in the cemeteries as Russians, because Russians apparently have different traditions and they have different way of burying their loved ones. In the most difficult moment of their life, people call me and tell me, this is outrageous. We were being pushed to this, almost the border of the cemetery because they are from their own community. So this question cannot be postponed for any longer. We had many debates during these 2 days, and there were views expressed that now it's not the time to write the Constitution. Now it's, we don't have the consensus. But we also are lacking the time and opportunities to find this consensus. So I will just end with this. I'm saying that there are enough Israelis who advocate religious pluralism in the Knesset and outside the Knesset. We will continue what we are doing, although the biggest problem of this issue is that, as painful as it is, it's not as relevant as it should be. It's not on the priority list of Israelis. Either, reforms, conservatives, secularists, ultra-Orthodox is just not high enough. Some are satisfied with the status quo, others think that it's outrageous, but they think that security and economic issues are way more important. We don't have the spare time, we don't have the luxury to deal with state and religion. It's considered to be a luxury. I consider it to be the vital part of our life, as Israelis, as Jews, and as Zionists. Thank you.
Thank you, Xenia. Dov?
Thank you, Leon. It's always great for me to come to the town where I grew up, in the Washington area, and always even better to be here on the days following a Redskins victory, so people are in a much better state of mind. I have to make a point in introduction to my words. 73 years ago, my Bubby, may she live and be well, my grandmother, when she was languishing and suffering in Auschwitz, if she could have imagined that 73 years later, we'd be having a discussion about all of the challenges of the 4 tribes or the 40 tribes or the 100 tribes within Israel, the challenge of how do we deal with the Jewish-Arab divide and how do we deal with divides within Judaism, she couldn't have imagined that we'd be in a time where we're even discussing these issues in a Jewish state within the context of a state of Israel. So whenever we talk about these very difficult issues, and sometimes they can be depressing at times, and sometimes it leaves people feeling hopeless and pessimistic, I always remind myself of this point, of the amazing times, the incredible times in which we live, that we're fortunate to be able to have this discussion, and the blessing that I feel that I can be part of trying to find solutions to these challenges. And also to remind ourselves that the state is 68 years old. 68 years old in the perspective of history. We're in our baby stages. We're just starting. And look at other democracies. Look at the United States when it was 68 years old. And look at where we are as a country with all of the challenges. Again, I view it as nothing short of a miracle. Everyone can define it in their own way. But we always have to view it in this perspective as well. And to say, don't think within the little box that we're in right now, but think in terms of historic terms. And that's also the approach that we have to take towards dealing with these issues. The religion and state challenges that we have in Israel are not challenges that we're going to fix tomorrow. We're not going to fix them for a year from now, and it's not going to be for 10 years from now. We have to be doing things now that will impact the situation and the discourse 50 years from now and 100 years from now. And that's the way we have to be thinking. And with that perspective, let me state very, very clearly, as someone who is Orthodox, as someone who's a rabbi, as someone who spent over 10 years studying in yeshivot and in rabbinic seminaries, I believe that religion mandated by the state is terribly, terribly damaging to the religion which I view and love so dearly. And as a result, it's very damaging to the state. I think it's a mistake. I understand historically why it happened, but I think it's only damaging to Judaism and to the flourishing of the state of Israel. So the question is, so now what? Okay, that is the situation, though. It's there. What do we do about that? And my perspective in dealing with this, and I'm going to focus my words right now on the issues that I've been dealing with in Israel, and that relates to the ultra-Orthodox community, which ultimately is the source of the tension that we have regarding these issues. And I have to tell you, and there are people in this room who will disagree with me strongly, I am nothing short of incredibly optimistic in terms of where we're heading in the long term. In the short term, and it's terrible, that there are people suffering, and I use that term very deliberately, suffering in a society, people who can't get married the way they choose, people who aren't accepted as Jews, people who are women who are chained and can't get married as agunot, all kinds of issues. People are literally suffering in the meantime, but in terms of the long-term outlook, I'm nothing short of optimistic. Why? It's an absolute fact that as the ultra-Orthodox community is insulated, the more they're insulated, the more they're in their enclaves, that's where the extremism is bred. And that's where the approach of everyone else out there is the devil, everyone out there is horrific, that's where that's bred. And the trend that we see in Israeli society is the younger generation, the ultra-Orthodox community, seeking ways to integrate into Israeli society. We see it in the areas of employment where we have a higher number. I'm focusing now on the males. The females in the ultra-Orthodox population, we're already at a very high percentage of employment, but the males, we've crossed 50%, and I see that trend only growing further and further as they seek to be part of the workforce. Higher numbers serving in the military than ever before. Higher numbers in higher education than ever before. These are trends which are only going to lead towards more and more moderation in the issues of religion and state, because what happens is, as they go to the workforce, all of a sudden there's a place of interface between the two communities. For the first time, ultra-Orthodox people are meeting secular people in some kind of a real way, and by the way, the opposite. Secular are meeting the ultra-Orthodox, and both are realizing that all these myths that they've been told for years and their entire education are false. I was having a discussion before with Muhammad about these issues with Jewish and Arab relations. We talked about if you just humanize it, if Jews meet Arabs and Arabs meet Jews, all the myths that they've been taught and been hearing about and the fall to the side, because you realize that they're just people like ourselves. And that's what's happening between the ultra-Orthodox and the secular as well. If I can capture it in just one anecdote, and I don't want to suggest that we've reached utopia, I don't want to come across as naive, but there's one CEO who I worked very hard with to convince him to hire Haredim, to hire ultra-Orthodox. He was very nervous about it. What's going to happen with their demands about how women dress? What's going to happen with the demands about the kitchen? He finally did it. And he reported back to me, and he said an incredible thing happened. A Hasidic fellow from Beitar, which is an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood, made a bar mitzvah, and he invited all the secular co-workers of his in his department to the bar mitzvah, made no demands at all about how they dressed, told them nothing, just come to the bar mitzvah. For those who understand the ultra-Orthodox community, that's an incredible step forward for someone to have that kind of courage. The flip side, one of the secular members of his company had got married and asked two of the ultra-Orthodox, the Hasidim, to be witnesses under his chuppah. Again, small little anecdote. I'm not suggesting this is happening en masse throughout Israel, but it shows what happens when we're able to bring the two together. My perspective is we're talking about 2-3 generations. 2-3 generations until we're able to break down those barriers. And on a political level, we'll see the results in terms of being able to resolve some of these critical religion and state issues. One story which is critical to understand in all of this, and I mentioned this during the last 2 days, is that the modern world is coming to them. No matter what the rabbis want to say, no matter what the community leaders want to say, it's coming to them. There's a CEO of a major cell phone company who told me that the number one store for sales in his company, the number one branch in sales per capita in a certain radius around the store is in Mea She'arim. Mea She'arim, the heart of the extremist ultra-Orthodox community. Why? How can that be? The highest number of cell phone sales? Because the rabbis demand that everyone purchase and own a kosher phone. A kosher phone is just a phone. No text messaging, no internet, a phone. And it has a stamp of approval from the rabbis. So they all purchase that phone. But they also all buy a smartphone. And they have it in their pocket, under the mattress, in the drawer. So people are buying two phones. And therefore, it's the highest number of sales in the country for this company. The world is coming to them, and they see the world. They want to be part of that world. And it's upon Israeli society to try to pave the way to make that happen. One last point is that there are many, many movements outside the government, which is not helping us in any way. In fact, undoing much of what the previous government that I was part of was able to accomplish on these issues. But there are a number of grassroots movements. The same way when it comes to Jewish-Arab relations, a lot of the success is going to come from some of the grassroots movements of people who are saying, let's reach out to one another and bridge that gap. So we're trying to reach on those levels as well. So we have renegade rabbis who are doing conversions against the state policies, doing marriages against the state policies, and trying to create a grassroots movement to try to force the state to make changes as well. So all of those things are happening. So in the near term, it's not a positive outlook in terms of the religion and state issues, and it is very much driven by the extremist agenda in terms of certainly reform and conservative Judaism being accepted in Israel. We can't even implement a government-approved policy about the Western Wall. So we're far from making progress. But in terms of the long-term prognosis, as long as we keep our eye on the ball, which is to continue making progress, regardless of what the government does, continue making progress on the ground, I'm nothing but optimistic in terms of where we can go and what we can achieve, and making Israel a Jewish state, which first and foremost allows all Jews to feel at home in a Jewish state. You think that should be the basic, and to get there, and also a Jewish state where every single citizen in the state completely feels at home. We have to keep working towards that, and God willing, we'll get there.
Thank you, Dov. Now, Ilana.
Hi, everyone. I have to say, sitting next to Rabbi Lippman, I feel less like a mutant or ideological mutant than I usually think of myself. I'm a person who spent 8 years as modern Orthodox clergy on the Upper West Side, and I currently work for the Shalom Hartman Institute, where I come into contact with the other 90% of the Jewish people in North America. And it's rather refreshing, I just have to say, given the changes in the modern Orthodox community, both in America and in Israel, to have such an exemplar of that combination of traditionally observant Judaism and liberal values. It's really something, I have to say. That said, I'd like to tell you two stories on, speaking of Leon's point about what state coercion does to religion. Two stories that took place, they're rather short, took place 10 years apart from one another. The first is when I was serving as a clergy member at Lincoln Square Synagogue on the Upper West Side. About twice or three times a year, I would have an Israeli woman knock on my door. You don't know me, but I'm here because I need you to teach me family purity classes so that I'm allowed to get married by the Rabbanut, and I'd like you to write me a letter. And that you've taught me. So I would sit with such women for about an hour at a time and try to give them the basics, first get a sense of what they wanted to know, and try to give them a genuine view on what the books that I hold my life by say about family purity laws. And then I would be very worried about what the letterhead that I put my note on for them was supposed to say, what it was supposed to call me, whether it would be legitimate. Did I have to call myself Rebbitzin in order to, and not doctor? I wasn't quite sure. But that was like a minimal experience, and a lot of these women were not so happy about their experience, but they were okay with it. And then I myself, several years later in my own family purity experience, had a rather negative experience with religious coercion at a mikveh in Jerusalem. And I said to myself, wait a minute, this is what other people are feeling. I didn't get it. And as much as the perspective that I had from somewhat sitting for an hour with people who randomly had to find me to talk to me about family purity law without knowing how strict I was going to be, how lenient I was going to be, whether I was going to be a good listener or a bad listener, actually being in that situation myself made me completely understand what was going on, even for that small second. And all that is to say that I think, speaking to Leon's point about what coercion of religion does to religion, you can't say enough about what a negative impact it has on religion, but you also can't say enough on how little people who are traditionally observant in the United States realize it's doing that in Israel. I have to say that if we were to work on something in terms of the secular religious divide in Israel and thinking about how pluralism can come to Israel more readily, it's actually to speak to people who are very comfortably, traditionally observant about the coercion that people are seeing and the fleeing from religion that people are doing as a result, or just quite frankly, feeling put upon by religion or feeling a sense of resentment towards their fellow Jews, which is incredibly problematic from my perspective. That said, I also think that there's something to do besides grassroots movements in Israel. Yes, it's true. The technical changes of just making legal change is unfortunately not going to work because there's going to be blowback, and you know there's going to be blowback. And the adaptive change of allowing grassroots movements to take place and continue, that's all fine and good. But I wonder, and this is actually based on my conversations with all these wonderful people these last 2 days, I wonder what the role of creating some sort of like real civics curriculum or some real sort of shared space across all 4 tribes can play in the interim while people are experiencing this coercive situation to help create a sense of camaraderie, even among people who deeply disagree and may even resent each other because of what they look like, because they assume that they are somehow related to the party that is coercing them. So I kind of wonder about that as something for us to think about, and not just about the grassroots efforts that are happening on their own. And then lastly, I would just say that I think part of the problem with religion and state is about education. So we've got legislation, we've got grassroots, we've got common interests when, say, even quote unquote Orthodox Jews in Israel don't like the conversion courts. But what about education? And what I mean by that is not just a civics education that actually allows people to have somewhat of a neutral playing field, but I also mean a different kind of religious education. And secularism can be your religion. National religious can be your religion. Haredi Judaism can be your religion. But what is the education that people are getting in their youth about their religion that makes them assume that it's a zero-sum game? So the political philosopher Avishai Margalit has this wonderful distinction that he makes between compromising the holy or the religious or the identity core and compromising in economic terms. He says economic compromise, it's not so easy, but you wrangle for long enough, you figure out who wins the cost benefit and make it as equal as you can. There's a substitution that can be made. But when you talk about religious compromise, you're really asking people to compromise on the holy. You're asking them to compromise on their identity. And when I first read that, I said, yep, that's totally true. As a religiously observant person, I don't want to compromise on the holy, not one bit. And then I thought about the fact that there are actually a lot of ways of conceiving of the holy. And there are a lot of ways of conceiving of identity. And maybe the problem is in the education system to begin with, that each of our 4 tribes in some way is taught that their identity is a zero-sum game with other people's identities, and compromising anything is a compromise of the holy. So if we think about how to tackle this problem, we have legislation, we have grassroots activism, we have education for American Jews, we have education in civics, and crucially and critically, education in religion. Education, and I say this not only because it pads my own pockets, because I'm an educator, that is what leads to those transformations. So instead of just getting the education when somebody is 25 years old and working for their first time alongside people who are different than they are, maybe there's something that can be done in the school system even earlier if we're willing to actually support the change agents who want to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilana. Noah?
It's an honor and a pleasure to be on this panel and to be in this place. Thank you very much. I gather that that a proposition about which every other person at this table agrees, the proposition that separation of church and state is necessary, is basically a moral desideratum or demand of our times, is one about which I am ambivalent. I don't disagree necessarily, but I don't obviously agree. First of all, it's worth noting that the state of religious life and, importantly, of secular life in Israel is much more varied and creative and vital and innovative and beautiful than we typically imagine. We are living through a golden age of Israeli secular culture. I think we're also living through a number of golden ages of Israeli religious cultures as well. But in Israeli secular culture, the state of Israeli film and music and literature and theater and comedy and humanities in the academy, even though they're desperately underfunded, and science, and in fact, a secular version of Yiddishkeit, the secular absorption of Jewish texts and Jewish forms and reformulation of these in a completely secular mode, which some of the early Zionists desired, very much saw as their project, I think is taking form in a way that 15 or 20 or 30 years ago we despaired could never happen, and yet it's happening in front of our eyes, which is to say that the state of affairs that exists today, and I have nothing positive to say about some of the coercions that have been mentioned, but the state of affairs today is less patently or less obviously, to me, damaging to the prospects of a vibrant secular culture than it's often taken to be. And I think that something similar is happening in religious cultures as well, which are changing dramatically in front of our eyes. And anyone who has followed the dramatic revolution of the place of women in Orthodoxy, including in ultra-Orthodoxy, and the cascade of changes, small and large, that has brought, that is bringing in front of our eyes, can attest to the fact that these religious cultures are changing in front of our eyes, including in ways for the better, for the dramatically better, for ways that advocates of separation of church and state would also recognize as being for the better. So separation of that there must be separation of church and state in the circles that I travel in is an article of faith, but it's a faith about which, as I said, ambivalent. Having the public square be a site of ongoing public adjudication of the questions of how religious sensibilities are to be balanced with the ironclad demands of democracy that recognize equal rights for all, for instance, without regard to gender or to sex, ethnicity, religion, and creed. That question of how these things are to be balanced in the public square, including about matters having to do with state power, is a state of affairs that I greet with some enthusiasm, alongside the great anxiety that other people on this panel have also discussed. The modern constitution in which, or the modern modus vivendi that sees a radical break between the sources of my moral judgment as an individual and the legitimate expressions of my political judgments as a citizen, that constitution that sees a radical break between those two things is one that I don't accept with alacrity or don't accept with total comfort. Now, I register, Leon, and I appreciate that you made the persuasive Tocquevillian point, I think beautifully and correctly, that a fully secular public square is a site of vital and lively moral thought, including morally informed thought. It's just not religious when it's in the public square, and I recognize that.
No, that's not. Religion is in the public square. There's no.
No, I understand. I understand that religion is in the public square as a force behind the expressions of individuals, but corporate religion and the interests of...
No, there are civic institutions that are religious. Religion just doesn't dominate the public square or dictate the terms of the public square.
Okay. So
Maybe you like that point less.
No, I don't. I think that I like that point more. And it's, again, I'm speaking as someone who's ambivalent about this. I'm not trying to press my case. I would be happy to shut off my microphone, having been persuaded that, in fact, there is nothing about which I ought to be ambivalent, but I'm still not yet fully persuaded. I think, by the way, that that the opposite of the Tocquevillian point could possibly be true, or at least have some purchase, that the results of forced meeting of religious and secular values in the public square, again, about matters explicitly of government policy, this meeting can be ugly and destructive, and often is, I think that this meeting can also be generative. I offer as an example what I take to be really the worst example I could bring to bolster my case, but still, my daughter is the most talented Torah reader that I know. She reads Torah beautifully, and she was asked to go and read Torah at the wall, as young women will be, and she was deeply conflicted about it and decided that she would go do it. And she goes monthly to the wall with the other women of the wall. And when I hear the stories and sometimes see with my own eyes how she is regarded, how she's spit upon and treated by people who believe that they have the full power of the state behind them, and insisting that a 22-year-old woman who reads Torah beautifully has no right to do that in this part of the public square, it is heartbreaking, it is awful, it is ugly. And at the same time, I find that the kinds of questions that it raises, including for my daughter, about how to balance the broad metaphysical beliefs of ultra-Orthodox and the broad metaphysical beliefs that she has about what Judaism is and how it should be practiced and where it should be practiced. That meeting is, in fact, one that has been very productive for her. It's an ugliness that I don't wish on her, and I don't wish on anyone, and I don't sanction, and I don't think should continue. But I do think that it is a generative meeting in many ways, and I observe that for her, and I compare this to the place of religion in the United States, which I regard typically from afar from Tel Aviv, and I'm certainly no expert, but where, for instance, in Texas, lawmakers manage effectively to ban abortions on the bogus grounds of somehow protecting the rights of women's health by ensuring that they be a certain number of kilometers or meters from a hospital every time they get an abortion, thus setting up a debate that is impossible to carry out in the public square on the real terms in which it should exist. And I'm not entirely sure that that alternative is, in its every instantiation, a better alternative than the Israeli one, crass as it is, ugly as it is, that forces us to ask these questions on the grounds in which they are really being fought, the deep grounds in which they're really being fought. And one of the reasons why I can allow myself, despite the ugliness of the debate now, to maintain this, or to at least maintain the flicker of the ambivalence that I have about it, is that I believe that there is a more than small chance that in the fullness of time this will be resolved, producing cultural change of more deep and profound value to Israel and to the individuals the citizens of Israel and the individuals who live in Israel than the kind of modus vivendi you get by separating them more clearly. And it is in some ways a matter of faith that I think that, or optimistic disposition. But it's also, to harken back to my very first point, and I'll end here. It's also the product of having observed the dramatic degree to which cultures in Israel, secular culture and religious cultures, are changing in front of our eyes in interaction one to the other. And I have no desire to diminish that, to cordon off that interaction, to diminish it. Now, one might argue that bringing the whole force of the state into this and having this debate devolve into people being abused and mistreated in mikvot is the worst way to have this debate. And that might be true. I might be wrong about that. I recognize it, but I'm not sure that I'm wrong. I'm not sure that this debate isn't generative and that my children's children won't look back and say that they are thankful that my daughter went through this and that I was willing to live with it.
Thank you. I haven't seen so many optimists in Washington since late October. We've talked about how various religious Jews should get along with various other kinds of religious Jews. We've talked about developments within Judaism. We've talked about varying definitions of Jewishness. We haven't talked about non-Jews. And I want to pose a question. To my comrades. Can you hear me yet? To my colleagues here, in two parts. One of the things that I detect in the debate in Israel, and to a certain extent here today, is a kind of deep discomfort with the multi-ethnic and multicultural reality of Israeli society. I'm not speaking ideologically now. No isms here. But it is a fact, it is a very colorful, florid fact, that Israel is both a multi-ethnic and multicultural society within the confines of Jewish society alone, right? And Israel is a multi-ethnic and a multicultural society as a state, which includes many citizens who are not Jews. And I want to pose to you, it's actually rather an American sort of question, which is that what if multi-ethnicity and multiculturalism was not the problem but the solution? In other words, what if it's actually, in other words, isn't it a fact that the only time that multi-ethnicity and multiculturalism is a problem is when there are authorities or institutions that arrogate themselves the power or the right to make definitions? But what if this whole search for definitions, certainly as Jews, Xenia, you brought it up, but I have spent my whole life debating publicly and privately whether Jews are a religion or a nation or a people or a this or a that. And the truth is we're all a little bit of all of this. And after a while, we turn out to be the best definition of a Jew is a Jew who wonders what the definition of a Jew is. And that's not interesting either. So what if, in fact, in the absence of institutions, governmental institutions, quasi-governmental institutions, and quasi-pontifical religious institutions, centralized institutions, which insist upon making definitions, what if, in fact, the answer is that that the Jewish community in Israel, like the Jewish community that existed in the diaspora long before Israel, is a pluralistic Jewish community as a matter of fact, not as a matter of ideology, right? And, in Jewish history, we flourished and survived because we existed as a plenitude of minhagim, basically. There were different Jewish religious communities. We all referred to the same scripture. We all referred mainly to the same Talmud, and we worked it out. And it worked. And similarly, beyond the confines of the Jewish community in Israel, isn't it the case also that instead of I'll stop here, Zionism inherited happily the European idea of nationalism, which is a very flawed one, according to which every nation should have a state, every state should incarnate a nation, the political boundaries and the cultural boundaries ideally should coincide. They never do coincide, so we have this thing called the problem of minorities. right? The Jews experienced what it was like to be that problem. Palestinians experience, Israeli Arabs experience. We all know about that. What if that whole framework is incorrect, and that it would be more healthy both for religion and the state if we regarded the multi-ethnic and multicultural nature of Israel as, in fact, the answer to the problem, and not the problem itself?
I do, to a large degree, regard it as...
You're ambivalent again, I see.
Yeah, to be a Jew is to be ambivalent.
It isn't. Yeah.
Not always, yes. To be this Jew is to be ambivalent. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that it is, to a degree, an answer, and I think that is something to which that ought to be a regulative ideal. However, I'm not so quick to give up also on some of the bounty of nationalism, which does in some ways bond people of different identities together in a meta identity. So I think of this as two-tier thinking. I think that yes, absolutely, we should view ourselves as a multi-ethnic society. Israel is the fact, like you said. We have no alternative, and it's a good state of affairs. However, I think that we need to seek and also to create ways to create cross-cutting connections and a broader identity that is kind of a roof or a tent over that, because it brings joy, and it brings meaning, and it brings more complicated identities, and it brings human connections that enhance each of the ethnicities that is individually part of the multi-ethnic framework.
It brings joy to people who are in the tent, but it doesn't bring joy necessarily to people who are outside the tent. In other words, I don't see that. Well, anyway, blah blah blah. Who has something else to say? Xenia.
First of all, I'll say that all my life, while covering war in the Gulf, Intifada in Gaza, revolution in Tahrir, I used to be an optimist. But after I came to Knesset, then I became a realist. Okay, not a pessimist, but a realist. Being a realist, I can tell you that basically I think that Israeli society is changing. And maybe for the first time in the whole 67 or 68 years of our existence, we are becoming a multicultural society. Multi-ethnic, definitely. We always used to be. But abandoning the theory of the melting pot towards more accepting of, I would not use the word minorities, but rather communities. Differences, yes. This is something that is actively taking place today. I personally prefer to look at our society as the gathering of brothers who were once, separated to their different ways, myriad of different ways, and then came to one land, to one home. And isn't it the time to update about each other? To ask, how have you been? How's this 2,000 years of galut has been with you? What are your cultural habits? What language do you speak? How do you perceive your being Jewish and Israeli and Zionist? So this exchange of ideas never happened until now. The communities were secluded. So for the first time, and it's still very limited, but I think that it's only the beginning of this issue that we see it in the Knesset. We see, and I'm a part. I'm very happy to be the head of caucus for the preservation of the culture of the Sephardic Jews. Because I'm an expert in this field, and everybody asks me, but you're coming from Russia, how can you head the caucus for, the culture of the Sephardic Jews? Says precisely because I'm from there, precisely. If we will just stay in the situation in which the Ethiopian Jews will protect the Ethiopian Jews and the Russians with the Russians, then, the tribalism will just flourish, and we will never actually become the one mosaic that we want to become. So I do think that any culture is an asset. It's not, it's not a problem. The problem is now how to convince the state of this theory. So this is just, another issue. I think, we will be able to deal with this because the face of Israeli politics is changing. Mm-hmm. The traditional, figures that used to be the politicians, the image of who the politician is, this is going through tremendous changes. So we are seeing much more variety of faces in the Knesset.
Except for one very important example, but go ahead, yes.
Yeah, and on one notion about women and orthodoxy, it was mentioned that there are amazing changes going on, and I'm again not an expert on ultra-orthodox and their life, although I have many friends from that community, surprisingly. But what I do see is that in total disobedience to the basic law of the Knesset, there are two political parties that are represented in the Knesset that completely prohibit from women to participate in the democratic political process, which are two ultra-Orthodox parties. Every bill that is designed to make the better of the situation of the women and to promote the situation inside these political parties and to enforce the basic law of the Knesset on them is being rejected. So in this regard, I see no improvement and even I would say deterioration, because even the talk, the possibility of them, maybe being part of either Shas or Yadut Torah is now being just reversed.
Something to say?
So this idea of the 4 tribes that were established during the conference these last 2 days, there was a slide that was shown about the religious Zionist camp, in which there was a pie, in which they were divided into about 10 or 12 different groups within their group. All of the traditional camps where people said, this is who we are, that's all very much falling to the side. When I came to join politics and got involved in the Yesh Atid party, which is a predominantly secular party, I all of a sudden learned that this term secular, which from my mind, living in my little English-speaking bubble in Beit Shemesh, where I moved to, secular Israel is not religious. And then all of a sudden I started finding out that within that term secular, there's such a wide spectrum in terms of religious observance, beliefs. So all of these traditional camps that we talk about in these tribes really, from my perspective, have sort of melted away. I think even if we maintain the different education systems, which I'm fine with, there has to be a determined effort of education within those systems, to be learning about the other, to actually bring children together, to bring adults into the room, to learn about one another, because there's no place of interface otherwise. And there's no doubt that from the youngest of ages, secular children meeting religious children within the Jewish community. Jewish and Arabs, they don't meet each other, and they don't have the opportunity to get to know and understand one another. That's where I think we really have the breakdown. So I'm very comfortable with a definition of with a Jewish state, which, as it says in the Declaration of Independence, is supposed to be providing equality for all the minorities within that Jewish state. I don't think we're living up to that declaration. But we have to be educating. And I believe that through education, that can happen. I have to tell you that for me as an American moving to Israel, this whole concept of all these different boxes, and it was so foreign to me. Define yourself. I never had to do that here. Here all of us stood up together and we all said the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States of America. And that's something which I believe Israel is lacking. And that's what we have to create. First of all, educating about one another and trying to create some unifying ethos, some unifying something which says that across all religious beliefs and across all faiths and across all boxes, we have something which brings us together as Israelis, and that's something we have to aspire towards.
Thank you, Dov. Ilana, and then we'll have time for a few questions.
So, Leon, on your question about whether nationalism should be a thing of the past, I think I go back to Ksenia's anecdote about...
Did I say that? No.
Meaning whether multiculturalism should substitute instead of nationalism.
No, but
that
go
nationalism.
Ahead.
No,
Go
please clarify.
No. I see no contradiction. No, never mind. I've said what I have to say. You talk.
Okay, I'll have to watch the video. What I just wanted to emphasize, I think, in the anecdote that Ksenia said about the question of, is it a religion? Is Judaism a religion? Is it a nation? When you asked your national religious friends and they couldn't answer the question, I think aside from nationalism being a 19th century phenomenon that we picked up, there is also a strong desire for Jewish self-perception to see itself as more than a religion, as an actual national people. Now, I don't know what to do with the fact that there are 4 tribes, and 3 of those tribes are Jewish, and one of those tribes is not Jewish. So what you're left with is exactly what Rabbi Lippman is talking about, is this sort of at the same time being able to look at the Jewish people as a nation while also being able to create Israeliness, which is something bigger than that. Now, how you do those two things at the same time, I think, is exactly what Israel's been trying to figure out for almost 70 years. And I think that's the challenge on the table.
We have time for a few questions. Are there mics in the audience? I think so. There's one all the way. A hand went up, but I don't see a body attached to it. There it is.
Hi, thank you very much. This is quite exciting for me. First time listening to these wonderful discussions. My background is from Africa, Nigeria. I'm a Christian, but I'm Igbo as a tribe. And in Nigeria, we have tribes who are Yorubas and so on and so forth. And you identified as your tribe and not by your religion. And everybody can be anything that you want to be. But your first identity is as a tribe. So the question to the panel, and I think some of those who probably were there earlier, it's in 1948 when the state of Israel was created. Was it created as a Jewish state or an Israeli state? And what does the Constitution say? And then the second question
There
is...
is no constitution.
All right, okay. So
There's
the
a
second
Declaration
question...
of Independence, however, that says something.
All right. So the following question is that, do you identify yourselves by tribe or by religion? Because my understanding as a Christian, and haven't from kindergarten and Sunday school, is that you have to be a Jew, you practice Judaism. But the common denominator is that you're Hebrew. So that's a tribe from Abraham.
Yeah.
And then those who chose to practice in this way are called Jews. So why not identify yourself as a tribe of Hebrew, and then some are Jews and some are Christians and some are Muslim?
Well, that is the million-dollar question. I guess you want to take it? I mean, I have a word to say about it, but you go first.
There are many. First of all, the Declaration of Independence says Jewish state, and talks about treatment of minorities, but it doesn't say what a Jewish state means. And we really haven't had that discussion for all the decades of the state's existence. Many people attribute that to the fact that we've been fighting for our existence and lives, and we haven't really. But now that discussion is being had and is being held, and it's a very important one. If you go to the Knesset and you ask that question, what does a Jewish state mean? I mean, there's 120 members of Knesset. Will there be 50 different answers to that question at least? Ranging from those who say that Jewish state means it has to be governed by halakha, by Jewish law, to those who say it's a place where Jews can find safe haven, to those who say it's governed by Jewish values, and we're having that discussion. That's part of what's taking place today. But in terms of the last point you made, that is a approach that we can definitely deal with in a land which is holy to the three major faiths in the world, where we can come from this perspective of children of Abraham and what that means in terms of unifying together. Not in terms of religious practice, but perhaps in terms of certain values or certain worldview which that can bring together. And there are faith-based initiatives in Israel today which are trying to bridge together the gaps in our societies based on that concept. But that could be the beginning. Again, not religious practice, because obviously we'll be all over the spectrum on that, but some kind of shared values which we could say all of us have as children, as the Abrahamic people, so to speak, which we all share in this land. That could be a basis for some kind of a formula for what that Pledge of Allegiance, so to speak, would look like.
I mean, I just would add that, I mean, I don't agree. I think that holiness would be a bad basis for anything that's supposed to unify disparate people. I think that to the questioner, I think when it comes to the Jews, you're going to have to make peace with a certain essential lack of clarity about the definition. The Jews have regarded themselves as a people from their earliest documents. They created a civilization. The civilization they created was fundamentally generated by a religion. It's silly to deny otherwise. Religion is at the heart of it. But the civilization that the Jews created as the centuries wore on was not entirely religious. Some of it was downright secular, even profane. And there is a sense in which the definition of what it is to be a Jew is overdetermined. Now, this lack of clarity should not be politically abused, and it can be politically abused. On the other hand, we have been many things. We have been many things, and some of the richness of Jewish life and Jewish civilization, and not just the internecine bitterness of Jewish life and Jewish civilization, is owed to this lack of clarity, is owed to this overdetermination. I don't think we'll ever have a definition, and until the Messiah comes, and I don't expect to see him in my lifetime, I don't think anyone will have the authority to issue a definition. So, et cetera, et cetera. Next question. Sir. Yeah.
So one thing that hasn't come up, at least in this part, is
Speak loud.
I said one thing that hasn't come up, at least in this discussion, is that next year will be the 50th anniversary of the occupation, which seems just as unresolved as it was 50 years ago. And I guess I have a chicken and egg question. Does the occupation have to be resolved in some way in order for this discussion, this debate among Jews, among Israelis, to be settled in a healthy, or at least to advance in a healthier way that some of the panel imagines? Or does this debate over how Jews get along with other Jews and what the nature of the state is, does that have to be settled before the occupation can be dealt with in a way that's more satisfying? Which is it, do you think?
Well, I believe that the question of the occupation and of continuation of control over the Palestinian population and threatening the demographic majority of Jews in the State of Israel and continuation of the State of Israel itself is a question that is relatively easier solved than the question of who is Jew. Okay, so this discussion will go on for probably, I don't know about the Messiah times, but for a few generations ahead of us, that's for sure. But as we're talking about the occupation, this is something that we, again, cannot postpone anymore. 50 years being long enough. The occupation is corrupting every sphere of our life. Of course, it's corrupting also the internal question of relations between Jews and Arabs, and also between various kinds of Jews and Israelis, leftists versus the right wing, and so on. It corrupts our attitude to our army. It corrupts the whole notion of what our army is. It effectively now became a police force, which primary idea is to control the population, which is not Israeli population, will not ever become Israeli population. I personally believe that if we were not to solve promptly this issue within the next few years, we will be forced to be in a situation with eternal civil war, okay, between different sorts of citizens, which we know what's the name for this reality. It's the A word, which nobody wants to pronounce in relation to our state, but we might have to if we will not solve it. And again, the 95% of the solution is known to us. It's known to us because we don't have to start from square one. There were people, believe it or not, before Netanyahu, and yes, they negotiated, and yes, they had maps, and yes, they had agreements. So this is the key question. What do we do with these agreements? We just throw them and start every time from the beginning and say, okay, how do we deal with this question of borders? How we deal with Jerusalem? How we deal with that? But this is, something to another. This is to another story, to another discussion.
Doug, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, without getting into anything at all in terms of the conflict, just to answer your question, there's no doubt that the right-wing, left-wing divide in Israeli politics precludes the overwhelming majority who want to resolve the religion and state issues from coming together. Meaning, so the idea of a construct in which we will gather together to deal with the religion and state issues is not possible because all of our politics tend to revolve around the right-left issues. So I don't see, on the political level in the near term, being able to resolve some religion and state issues because we have the right-left-wing divide.
I mean, to be fair, there is a small group of Jews, a minority, but many of them live on the West, in the territories, for whom Jewish sovereignty over those territories is an essential part of their Jewish identity, and who regard that Jewish identity as validated scripturally. There is, and not just scripturally, but through generations of interpretation and so on. I think it's safe to say that even though they are the majority, whether the only Jewish population in the territories, they are not the majority of even the religious Jewish community. And I think it's safe to say that that the occupation of the West Bank is not, in my view, is not a condition for the continued formulation of Jewish identity and Jewish culture. It's a moral and a political problem faced by a state which is occupying another people. In that sense, Israel is like other states, well, et cetera, et cetera. One more question.
And it's also, I just want to say, you can also believe, and I'll put myself in that category, you can believe that there's a scriptural and religious basis for it, but being willing to compromise that for the sake of reaching a solution to the conflict as well.
Absolutely. So. Okay, I'm told we're out of time, so one more question. Right here, yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting. As I said, I'm a member for UNESCO Task Force. I regard what you say from outside, from my friends in Japan, Korea, China, and so on. I was involved in two projects, Europeana project to identify the contribution of the Jews to European history and culture, and World Digital Library project. My question is, how shall we, there's a huge interest, talk about what you say, what is missing in the information about what is going on in Israel, so that we can share in more informed way, whether in China, Korea, Japan, and even in Europe. There's a lot of misunderstanding, and your brothers and sisters are suffering, and plus others. So I don't want to be go too far, right. But what I heard today makes sense. But how do you give voice which can be understood to Palestinian, Jews, Druze, and others in Israel, so that Israel can be understood for the Jews in Israel and for the Jews around the world and for the whole world? I hope it makes sense. Thank you.
Well, no, go ahead, Xenia, if you have something to say.
I'm a politician. I have to say about almost everything. Huh? But generally speaking, I can tell you that, Rabbi Dov knows it very well from the Knesset. We all are meeting a lot of delegations from every part of the world in the Knesset every time. So sometimes it seems like the main occupation that we do in the Knesset. And the only thing that I'm trying to relate and to transfer to the people whom I meet, and usually the guide says to me, you have 20 minutes, please explain to them about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Okay. I only want them to live with the sense that it's complicated, that it's not black and white. Nothing is black and white about this country. It's religions, it's conflicts, and it's description. So the picture it's very multifaceted, and it's many colors in it. Okay, so just to convey this complexity, I think this is a goal for us, the lawmakers, the people of the NGOs, and every citizen of Israel that tries to explain, what we are about.
That's not a uniquely Israeli problem, by the way. Try explaining in 20 minutes the two Koreas, or the relationship between Japan and China. I think, Israel is still, and I think will always be, an open society. I think you have to learn Hebrew and Arabic, and you have to follow what actual Israelis and Palestinians are saying and writing, and form an impression on the basis of that. The deeper you get immersed into a culture, the better you understand it. I want to thank our friends for being with us, and I want to thank you for coming. Thank you very much.